Well, gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for joining me. My name is Brian Croft, and I'm encouraged and excited about having this conversation with my brothers, part of the team of Practical Shepherding. I have Hector and Matthew and Ronald with me, and we're just going to have a discussion about not just our ministry, but the need of our ministry and the things we're trying to address really around the world. And so thanks for joining us, guys. We're here to talk about some specific things. See, there's a serious problem that we're all aware of. Pastors just aren't thriving. Matter of fact, they're struggling. I'm finding they're just surviving. Some of the things that I'm seeing is this isolation and loneliness and depression even. We work with pastors who are having suicidal thoughts. We've been in situations where pastors even die by suicide. And many of these pastors are serving in really hard places around the world. Ministry's hard enough, but in certain places, you add ministry and the difficulties of just hard living. And it's hard to imagine what some of the pastors are going through. And so churches are struggling because pastors are struggling. Churches aren't being planted because churches and pastors are struggling. And ultimately, it leads to the gospel not going around the world where it needs to be. And certainly it's the hard places where a lot of times the gospel needs to go the most, and it just isn't going there. And a lot of people don't want to go to the hard places to take the gospel. Matthew, we talked a little bit about the problem we're facing, this crisis really all around the world for pastors.
Yeah, pastoral ministry it's a great privilege. It's a great joy to serve as a pastor. It's in many ways just a sweet gift from the Lord to have the opportunity to do so. But all pastoral ministry is hard and it's difficult. And I think the things that you've highlighted there, just that sense of isolation, often feeling ill-prepared, ill-equipped to deal with the certain struggles that people are facing. And that has an impact. It has an impact on the pastor's health, on his own spiritual well-being, on his family. Ultimately, it impacts the church that he's leading. You know, God has this beautiful design for reaching the nations, and that's through the planting and the strengthening of healthy local churches. And those churches are to be led by men who've been raised up, equipped, and gifted by God to serve as pastors of those churches. And when that pastor is struggling, it's just inevitable that the church is not going to be thriving. And if the church isn't thriving, then people aren't being reached. And so when we say it's a crisis, it is legitimately a crisis. There are pastors all around the world, and this isn't unique to North America or Europe. It's also relevant in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And these issues of just the social issues and the ministry issues is universally true. Now, like you said, in the hard places, it's exceptionally true. So when we say the term hard places, we're talking about where life is hard. So all ministry is hard. That's a given. But in certain communities, it's harder to find a good job. You're dealing with all the social issues of abuse, addictions, mental health, fatherlessness, access to training, resources, good quality housing. So to be a pastor in a context like that, where you yourself are just struggling to survive, to feed your kids, to raise a family, and now you're ministering to people who are all struggling to survive, to feed their kids, to raise a family, to get through life. When you're dealing with trauma and abuse and neglect every day, and you're doing it by yourself, how are you going to thrive? And how's your church going to thrive?
You make an interesting point there at the last thing you said was they're trying to do it by themselves. So this is hard enough, we all know. But in our experience, most pastors around the world are laboring by themselves. They don't have other pastors. They don't even have a really good support system within their own church. And so these pastors really feel isolated and alone because a lot of times they are. And it's depending on the situation, but that's the one thing we find that it's impossible for a pastor to thrive when he's having to serve by himself, unless there's someone who can come alongside him and help him and support him.
Sometimes pastors don't even know they're not thriving. You know, they think they're doing well. They're running on their own sense of strength and identity in pastoral ministry. But when you actually peel back behind the surface, there's real struggle. It affects their health. It affects their mental health. It affects the way they're talking to their children, the way they're loving their wife, the way they're ministering to their congregation. and you realize, oh, actually, there's a problem here that you don't even know you have.
That's a good point.
And it's affecting every relationship that you're in, and the impact of that isn't just going to be felt by you and your local church and your family. It's going to be the impact of that is your community that isn't being effectively engaged and reached because you're constantly putting out these little fires in your own life or in your own ministry.
Something that's exciting for me in this conversation with you guys is we have quite the representation of practical shepherding all around the world here. We have representation at this table of ministry leaders working in North America and in Europe and Latin America and Africa. And so I'd love to hear from you guys in regard to this need we're talking about. Hector, what's a specific need that you see in the Latin American countries around pastors, and what's causing them to struggle?
Well, it's interesting because while I hear you speak, I could just recall the unique challenges in Latin America with pastors being by themselves. They don't have other other elders to be pastoring with them. And then another thing is that the Latino culture, like you gotta work until you're down and out, and so you can't show any kind of weakness. And this is taking pastors to their ultimate level. And what's happening is that they're getting burned out, they're getting tired, they don't know how to proceed. And I think some of that has to also do like, what are you doing in ministry? And maybe you're doing many things that other people could do and not focus in the ministry per se. And also like the pastor's soul, because he's given so much that's just taking a toll in his life. And the thing is that there's been quite a resurgence of the gospel in Latin America. So there's a lot of people, getting to know Christ, coming to salvation. So these churches are getting filled up, but there's solo pastor, and this doesn't help. And just because they're focused in many areas where maybe they need to focus more, in the shepherding and the preaching, and instead of delegation, I think is one of the things that they need to learn how to do. How do I delegate? And people won't think I'm not lazy or I should be doing this, like expectations of the people. And so that's some of the challenges that we're seeing.
You bring up a unique challenge that pastors pray about. They want their churches to grow. They want ministry to happen. And it's interesting because I will work with a lot of pastors who are on the edge of just burnout and struggling, and they're exhausted. And they begin to articulate to me how they got there is basically God is answering all their prayers.
Yeah.
Like, so you said the gospel's growing in these places, and we praise God for that. Yeah. The problem is the churches grow, but then the pastoral leadership doesn't. Yeah. And so that it actually makes it harder on that pastor to be able to care for all those people. And that's part of the problem. Yeah. So Ronald, let me turn to you. What is maybe one challenge you're seeing in the African context with pastors?
Yeah, I think one is cultural. When you go to Africa, people have a lot of expectations from the pastor. People tend, if you are the pastor, people think you have all the knowledge, the strength, the resources to give to people. And so that leaves you as one person somewhere in a corner, alone as a pastor, where people expect you to do everything. And when they come to you, they don't want to hear you can't do anything. They expect a guy who you are always pouring in, and they have this like you are a super guy. So you find some pastors, even they don't talk about their struggles with anyone because they don't want to feel that they are not as what people think about them. So they are living in that place where they feel, I need to put this up, otherwise people won't trust me. As I do ministry, people will say this is not he's not a faithful pastor, or he's not a pastor who is always there for people. So what you find, pastor they get burnout, but they will not accept it. It's sort of like you got to go and do until Jesus will take you home. That's what we have in Africa, and people don't understand their pastors. You talk to people about praying for the pastor, pray for your pastor. And they're like, what do I pray for the pastor? It should be the pastor to be praying for me. That's cultural because, people think those who are up there, they should do that. But I think also it's when the pastor is alone for longer periods and no one is speaking their lives, that becomes a life. They live because they have no choice to any other life. And hence, as we talk about them, burning up, or we talk about them not being able to accomplish certain tasks, and as Matthew has said, sometimes they don't know even whether they are burned up, because this has come part of their life, and they don't know any other way to do ministry, but that's the only way to do ministry.
What you articulated is really we see all over the world. The pastors feel this pressure to have to do and do and do and be the one to carry all the load, but then also can't be honest and open and transparent about their own struggle with this. Because a lot of times churches don't know what to do with that. My pastor struggles, so pastors end up not being very authentic and even have a secret life and things that they hide from the church that it becomes very destructive to the church.
Sometimes pastors do open up and it backfires on them.
That's right.
And so they might share a struggle with somebody else in leadership of the church, and then that then turns against them. And we know stories where men have been fired because they were just open and honest about some of the struggles they're facing. And so they don't feel like they have even just the safety within their own congregation, who should be their church. I mean, you're as a pastor, you need your church to be your church as well. And they don't feel like they have that because they often have been tripped up in the past.
I think also when pastors see what is happening in the world all over, how pastors are dealt with when things come up. So they fear to come up and say, because they feel, I don't want to be treated the way the other guy was treated. So the shame of also keeping the identity of being a pastor, we want to preserve this. We want to preserve our honor. We want to preserve us. So as you have said, you'll find pastors can be seen, great sin, but they will not say anything because they fear the consequences of that. I think in some way, pastors have lacked people who love them and who would just come alongside them and say, hey, brother, I love you. I know you are struggling with this, people they can confide in and pray together with. And so they fear, like, this has happened to so-and-so. If I just open up, I'm gone.
Yeah. Matthew, I was on a call recently with a couple of British pastors, both who had been fired in the last month from their churches. And they were just reeling, and they called me because they had no one to turn to. And that was part of the conversation, is where do these pastors turn to? I want to talk about Europe from your context. So just to give a little background, you're born in Norway, you grew up in Scotland, you live in Kentucky, you have like 18 passports or something like that. Most of them, that would be Europe. And so talk a little bit about what you see in Europe and even Great Britain specifically.
Europe is such a challenge in terms of ministry because the evangelical Christian world all across Western Europe is so small. So everybody knows everybody. And so if you're in Scotland and you're a solid, healthy gospel preaching pastor, likelihood every other solid, healthy gospel preaching pastor knows of you and knows of your church. It's such a small Christian population and a shrinking Christian population, which comes with challenges. Part of the challenge is the lack of resources, the lack of support systems around you. But also part of the challenge is it's nowhere to hide. There's nowhere to, everybody sees you, and there's a almost like a comparison, competitiveness, kind of survival of the fittest mentality in some contexts. But and because of the historical nature of Christianity in Europe, there is still a strong denominationalism, and within which can become tribal. And so you're only in this one little tribe, and you're kind of suspicious of the other tribe over there, and there's no collaboration or collegial thinking in many of these contexts. And that's true in the UK. It's also true in other parts of Europe as well. And so and then there's a legacy. So when there's a legacy, then there's a tendency to think everything's going to be okay. We've got a nice building, we've got these universities, we have access, we have the history of the Reformation swept through Europe. And so where there's a legacy, you have a false sense of health because you have these institutions that are present, but it's really just a shadow, it's a shell. But when you peel that away, the church is really struggling. Small churches with high cost of living, and so churches that struggle to pay a decent living wage for their ministers and a culture that has very quickly turned against Christianity in kind of this hyper secular, progressive Western European worldview. So now it's now you're only struggling as a pastor in a small church, but you're also struggling to be identified as a pastor, to be known to be a pastor in a context that is very hostile towards Christianity in general. And so it makes you feel very alone, very isolated, very ill-supported, poorly supported.
That's one of the things that amazes me about all the years I've done ministry in Britain and in Europe is it is a small group of people. The secularization of the culture has just done a number on pastors and churches and just the evangelicalism as a whole, just the gospel to go out. And yet, you said it, there's that territorialism despite that. You would think that would cause everybody to come together.
And there's
but it doesn't in a lot of ways.
Life-sucking about being a group of 20 people in a old building that can hold 500 people.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? And so yes, you have facilities and buildings, and there's a heritage, and there's money's been invested over the last 300-400 years in Christendom in Western Europe, but trying to maintain that is such a struggle that I think people just really, when we've seen that, we've walked into buildings like, oh, this is so sad. And you have to do that every week.
Yes.
It just feels so oppressive.
As far as North America, I find it interesting that there's a lot more resources in North America than there are in other places around the world. And yet these are still some of the same problems that North American pastors are facing. And in North America, it may not be a hard place because of poverty, but it is hard for a lot of other reasons, from just the spiritual darkness and oppression that are certain areas of North America, to then the lack of pastoral support, the lack of the tribalism that exists even among these groups. One of the curses of having a place that has a lot of resources and a lot of churches and even a lot of pastors is that we will divide on small things and not realize that we actually need to come together and support one another. So ironically, there are a ton of pastors in isolation and alone and struggling in North America out of the abundance of the resources that North America has. So I find it fascinating as I listen to each one of you guys, how a lot of the same problems, the same needs exist all around the world, just in a different context and culture and country, which is why Practical Shepherding is trying to address so many of these different things. We kind of tell people pastors exist because every Christian needs a pastor. Every Christian needs to be shepherded. But who pastors the pastors? And though there are a few churches, that's the minority, that have elders or have legitimate support in the church for the pastor, the overwhelming majority of churches do not have that in the least bit, which creates this solo environment for the pastor to have to just slug away on his own. 80% of churches are 100 or less around the world. 50% of pastors don't even make it 5 years in the ministry. 80% of pastors don't even make it 10 years in the ministry. That speaks to a lot of different things, but I think there's two specific things that stat addresses. Number one, ministry is just hard. We've established that. We've been talking about that. Ministry is just hard. To be on the front lines of the gospel going forth around the nations, the enemy does not want that. It's going to fight against that. And so pastors are attacked. Missionaries are attacked on the front lines of this work. But there's also a second reason I think that stat exists, that ministry is done in a certain way that is unsustainable long term. It's one of the things that Practical Shepherding is trying to address is not just to come alongside pastors and help them and support them, but also to train and teach them actually how to stay in the ministry a long time, how to do this in a way that actually is sustainable, recognizing that we're not God. God is God, but we're not. We're just men. And we're one person, and we're oftentimes asked to be more than we can be. So, Matthew, I want to turn to, let's talk about how Practical Shepherding is trying to address some of these needs so that we can see pastors thrive, which then would lead to churches thriving and churches planted and the gospel going ultimately to the unreached. That's what we desire to see. So, Matthew, talk a little bit about Practical Shepherding and how we're trying to address this need of lonely, isolated, struggling pastors.
Yeah, so Practical Shepherding, we want to see pastors thrive in the hard places, and ultimately the goal would be to see them persevere so we can turn around some of those numbers. Pastors in a hard place, persevering for the long term with faithful, godly ministry that sees men and women come to faith and churches be planted. It's the main mission strategy that we see in the New Testament, and we want to be a part of that by strengthening pastors who are struggling. And we're going to do that. We do that in three primary ways. Number one is we produce content, whether that's the books we produce, the workshops that we provide, the conferences, the podcasts, the training, the resources. We're producing content that is accessible, that's been translated in multiple languages, that is very practical, very relatable for any pastor to be able to pick up and say, okay, this is my toolkit to help me figure out how to do these things well, how to raise up new elders, how to preach faithfully, how to plant churches in a way that's going to be sustainable. So really good, robust content, how to care for my own soul, my own family, my own, how to care for the sick in my flock, and how to do these things. So I want to come alongside pastors, produce excellent content that's going to be relatable, accessible, and in their language. And so through some of the translation projects we have. And so content is number one.
And let me add something to that the content we produce, this will be obvious, it's practical. Mm-hmm. It's meant to be practical. We're practical shepherding. Yep. One of the holes in the literature we've been trying to fill from day one is we know there's good seminary training, there's good theological training. And there's people even, not just in North America, but around the world that are able to have access to some of that training, others not. But when in doubt, we want to provide practical resources that speak to what every pastor has to be able to do.
Yeah.
And seminaries do a great job of theologically training pastors, but seminaries aren't built to teach pastors how to be pastors.
Yep.
They have to learn that somewhere else.
Yeah.
And that's one of the voids we are trying to fill.
Yes, you want to come alongside pastors. We use the term like the field guides, the resources that we're using to say, hey, this is your toolkit to do your job well. If you're struggling, say, I don't know what to do. How do I do this funeral for this unbeliever? Or how do I visit this widow? How do I do these things? I want to come alongside you with good, robust resources to help you minister well where you're at. So good content. Second is cohorts. Pastors struggle because they feel alone. They feel isolated. No one's really speaking into their context, into their life. They may go to a big conference or go to a seminary course, and it's great, and it gives them some good knowledge, but we want to create friendships and a collaborative group of men who are ministering in similar contexts that can learn from each other, care well for each other, and grow together. And so practical shepherding cohorts, we have kind of three primary cohorts that we're focused on. One is the practically trained pastor cohort, which Brian leads. This is a 2-year training, year 1, year 2, kind of webinar-based with interaction with guys totally free. Any pastor can be a part of it, working through a curriculum that's really about how to do practical ministry well. Lord willing, we're releasing that in Spanish next year as well with Practical Shepherding Espanol. So practically trained pastor cohort. Church in Our Places cohorts. So Church in Our Places is specifically for those doing ministry in areas of poverty, resource-poor communities globally. Again, it's a 2-year curriculum where men from a particular region, so East Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa, Brazil, will gather together monthly. We'll discuss a topic, typically theological or ministry competency-based, and then come together for a retreat. So really deepen and strengthen those relationships. So over the course of those 2 years, they're growing in their own theological understanding and the understanding of the word and their ministry, but also developing friendships. At the end of those 2 years, they'll say, no, I'm not alone in this. I've got this group of peers that actually care about me, and we're growing together. So the Church in Our Places cohorts, we've got cohorts all around the world, 35 countries, 8 language groups, led by great regional leaders in each of them. The third one, and this is really important, is the women's ministry cohort. Yeah. So we have a women's ministry at Practical Shepherding, and it's providing a couple of different kinds of cohorts. The first one is for pastors' wives. If the pastor's wife is struggling, the pastor is not going to thrive. And so, the pastor's wife has a particular burden and a particular challenge that is unique to a pastor's wife. And we want to acknowledge that. We want to be able to speak to that. We want pastors' wives to have a safe space where they can raise some of those challenges.
We have found that the pastor's wife needs care just as much as the pastor does. So we're trying to meet that need as that part of the ministry starts growing.
Yep.
So this cohort you're talking about with the women's ministry is going to be a key part of that.
Yeah. So both the wives of pastors having this care group that they meet with monthly for prayer, for support, for mentoring. And then the second to that is women's ministry leaders. So there are also women doing faithful ministry, evangelizing, discipling other women in their community, but they need to be trained and cared for as well and equipped. And so having both those tracks and practical shepherding women, I think is going to help the pastors thrive as well in their congregations.
The cohorts, it's amazing how God has used them because we figured out how to utilize technology to do this. And I think that as I look back on the history of our ministry, that was really a game changer when we figured out how to use technology, and not just technology, but how do you use this in a way you still capture the intimacy, the honesty, the fellowship that you want to try to have among pastors.
Yeah.
And these cohorts, we figured out how to do that. It was interesting to go through COVID when everything was shutting down and churches are scrambling, trying to figure out what to do. How do we move things online? And in the kind providence of God, about 2 years before that, we had launched these cohorts and we had done a lot of the work to figure out what works, what doesn't work. How do we do this? We were busy during COVID, one, because of how pastors were being affected, but two, we had people reaching out to us saying, hey, how do we do this online? And it was a opportunity to do ministry. But that part of the ministry just exploded really for us. And it continues to, because online you're able to reach so many people because you only be in one place.
Yeah, the great thing about the cohorts as well is it's easily reproducible in different contexts, different language groups, different environments. It's just a local leader with a group of pastors who are meeting together monthly for a dialogue to share with each other, and then come together for an in-person retreat. So each of our cohorts are invited to a retreat each year, whether that's in Kenya or in Louisville, Kentucky. We have these gatherings because that's important as well. But the fact it's non-residential is a plus because these guys, they can be part of a 2-year training and they don't have to leave their community. Yeah. They don't have to travel. They don't have to go anywhere. They don't need to invest any money in it. So if the church doesn't have a budget for training or retreats, just practical shepherding is going to provide that for you. And so content, cohorts, and then the third piece is care. We want to provide really good, robust care for pastors and their families in need who are struggling. And we provide that in really 3 main ways. One is our Shepherd's House location. So the vision behind the Shepherd's House is just a space where pastors and their wives can get away for up to 3 days, no charge to them. Just get yourself to one of our locations and just spend time with each other. Just renew, refresh, rest. Maybe have an opportunity to meet with another pastor and his wife over a meal and just kind of unload, share some burdens with a safe person who you can do that with. And then, so we've got now 6 locations around the world that are available on our website where any pastor can access and take some time to do that.
One of the things we talk a lot about is that noise and busyness is the best way to avoid your own soul. So if we can provide a place to allow you silence and stillness and solitude. We don't have a bunch of programs. We don't have a plan for you, an agenda. You just come. Yeah. And some people just sit and pray and walk and breathe and just enjoy their family or their wife, if their wife's able to come with them. And others are able to use it for just time to think and process the difficulties of ministry. We even provide people to come and be able to sit and talk with them, even providing someone, knowing loneliness and isolation is part of the issue. Our ministry tries to provide someone to come even just for a couple hours to be able to, if they request it, to be able to sit with them. But that is an important piece of care because it speaks to how we think pastors care for themselves, and that you have to remove yourself out of the busyness in the rat race of ministry and life to be able to get care.
And we'd say just do it every year. Just find one of our locations.
Yeah,
just
that's
make that a part of your annual rhythm of taking 3 days out, just you and your wife, and just recharge and do that.
I also want to say the reason it's free, and we raise money in part to pay for it so pastors can come do this for free, is because most pastors don't have any money.
Right.
So to provide a place, knowing a lot of times what keeps pastors from doing this is, I know I need to get away. I know I need some help. I don't know where to go, and I don't know how to afford that. So that's why it's free for those who are curious. Most pastors who need it the most, can't pay for it.
The other 2 care components is counseling. We provide subsidized counseling both for the pastor and his wife, or anybody in ministry, essentially, to provide kind of one-to-one counseling with trained practitioners in the counseling field. And then third is the mentorship. And any pastor can reach out to us and just say, hey, I'd love to have a phone call, a Zoom call with one of your leadership team and just help me think through some of these issues that I'm struggling with, whether it is a ugly business meeting is about to happen and they think they're about to get fired. How do I prepare for that meeting? Or if it is just, hey, I'm struggling in my marriage and I don't know how to lead my wife well in this area. So we just want to be there, want to come alongside pastors so they can thrive and their churches can thrive in their communities, and ultimately so that the unreached can be reached through the preaching of the word and the planting of the churches.
Yeah, that's an excellent summary. So these 3 C's, really everything we do is captured in content, cohorts, care.
Yep.
And it's been amazing to see all that God has done. And these categories are helpful because we have so many moving parts now as a ministry. But those really are the 3 key components of how we try to care for pastors to help pastors thrive and wherever they are around the world. I want to shift to talk about the impact that we're trying to have. It's amazing. This ministry 16 years ago started as a couple of little books on practical ministry and a blog back in the day where blogs were big. They're not as much anymore, but back in the day, blogs were a big thing. And we started a blog and started just conversations online about these kinds of things. And we discovered this massive need of pastors needing care and how lonely and isolated they were and how much they were struggling. We never imagined, I'll speak personally as the one from the beginning, I never imagined seeing a ministry that would grow globally to reach literally thousands of pastors we impact every year through these efforts of content and cohorts and care. I'd like to ask each of you guys as leaders of this ministry with us, what kind of impact are you seeing in the world where you're coming from? So Hector, let me first go to you in regard to Latin America. Would you maybe give one example of an impact that we're trying to have that you're seeing?
Well, it's interesting because I think there's a chain reaction to all of this. I could talk from experience. Last year, I was struggling myself in ministry. And obviously you came alongside me, Brian, and helped me through that, and obviously through articles and your books also. Just taking care of my soul, taking care of my health, and how that impacted my wife as well, because when you take care of yourself, then you're taking also care of your family. So that was impacting, my family as well as the church. But also through that, and through other men in Latin America that have seen what has happened to me, then has caused them to ask, hey, how did you deal with this certain issue? Or even signs of depression or signs of burnout. Because, they've been doing, ministry for 12 years in a row, haven't had vacation. And that's another thing, in the Latino world, not everyone has vacation time. Many of the pastors have to work separate jobs. It's not like they have a salary that they could depend on and just take, a month and let's take a sabbatical. That's almost non-existent in the Latino world, basically. And so, just recently, a few months ago, someone contacted me, read an article online in our website, and said, I think I'm struggling through some of this situation. I think my spiritual life is not as fruitful as it should be. I'm doing ministry, but I don't feel I'm thriving. And just through a mentorship, through a phone call, a Zoom call that we did, and it just pointed him to some of the things that I've actually walked through your guidance and discipleship, and told him to take care of himself. And I asked him this question: can you take a sabbatical? He's like, I can't do that. I can't just leave the church. I don't have anyone to leave it with. And I told him, well, what's the most time you could take out and have someone there to take care of the church? He said, maybe 2 weeks. I'm like, okay, take 2 weeks and make the most of that. And, and he did. He left a couple men in charge of the church for 2 weeks. He took that time off with his wife, just went to walk up the mountains, and just took his wife to eat a couple places, and he was renewed. He was refreshed because he thought like, the church was wholly dependent on him. And I told him, well, brother, I mean, you're a big piece to this puzzle, but, God will take care of his church. Mm-hmm. And once, he felt that liberation, coming, like, I could take time for myself. I'm like, yes, brother, you need that time. You need to take care of yourself before taking care of the church of God. He, till to this day, he texts me and tells me, hey, brother, thank you for the guidance. Thank you for the mentorship. So that's just one example of how this mentorship is working.
Appreciate you sharing that. And I love the chain reaction metaphor you use, because that's really what we're doing and what we're seeing. We're investing in pastors and helping them, then for them to go and help other pastors, and then for them to go and help other pastors. And for the families to be affected by that, for hopefully to go back into your ministry, to be able to thrive more. That's really what we're trying to do. We know we're limited. We can't be everywhere. But for pastors to help each other is a big part of what we're trying to train guys to do. Ronald, you also have a similar kind of story in that you are a part of Church in Hard Places from the very beginning, as you now lead the East Africa as part of Church in Hard Places. What's one impact you've seen in your ministry and the impact specifically of Church in Hard Places?
I'll go first to myself. I think there's a time, I'm the kind of a person who you want to work and work and work and work. I think after like 3 years in, I reached a point where I felt like I was so tired, but then I would not explain the tiredness, where it was coming from. And so I was thinking, I got irritated, you get irritated quickly with things, and even at home, things are like, you feel you want to rest and your kids are running over you. So I think there's a time I had a call with Matthew and I was talking about, hey, I need to go do this, I need to do this, I need to do this, I need to do this. And I think as we were ending at the conversation, Matthew told me, hey, remember to rest. Take time off and just also rest. Don't just go and go and go. And I thought like, okay, I'm alone. How am I going to go? So I didn't tell him, but I was like, how am I going to go? And I talked to my wife. I said, what do? We can't just get out. And so my wife said, okay, if Matthew has told you that he's a good brother advising you, do this. Let's take a few days off. We went away for a week. I think after 3 years, we went away for a week. Just do nothing. We didn't carry a laptop. We didn't carry anything. Just went and be with my wife. And that we from that day, we have made it a habit. Like every year, we need just to push back and be with my wife. And we have a time when we are with the kids. And that has helped us, just a lot. Just it has taken away from me thinking, if I'm not here, the work won't go on. As Hector has just said, this is the Lord's work. You're just a puzzle in what is going on. Trust the Lord in it. With the work itself, I'm working with a brother whom we have just revitalized at church. This brother has been working for the last 10 years. He doesn't know the word off. And it has become part of his DNA. So even when you talk about resting, it's like, what are you trying to talk about? But recently, I've just told him, hey, you need to get away, whether you like it or not. And that church won't collapse. And it has been a tug of war because he doesn't feel like, and I said, no, you need to go away, brother, because that's part of soul care. And I was really happy because he came to me after a month and he told me, you know what? I've decided I'm going to go away for a month. And I told him, praise be to God. And so he asked me, hey, so how do I go through this? And I said, don't worry, we'll see how we can just help you just to go away with your wife because the kids are big kids. We'll just see how we can go and just rest. And so that has been, a blessing. And I have guys in Uganda whom we chat, and they're like, man, I feel where I am. I'm not thinking well. Or, someone tells you, my wife irritates me too much. And I just know there's a, and I'm like, take a few days away and see if you come back, you'll be irritated by your wife. Yeah. And guys have done that. And they're like, oh, I feel fresh, Not because the wife was doing anything wrong, it just burnout. It feels like, it feels like, no, I'm so, it's the body that is tired and he needs to, we call guys to pray together on the phone, just praying together with them. I'm going through this particular issue. So some guys, we have calls, just a call. Let's pray. Or how do we go through this? There's a brother who was in the cohort, I think last cohort. He called me and he said, bro, we are 22 of us in our church. I said, all right, praise God. And he said, I'm planning to plant 3 churches next year. And I said, okay. And he said, and I told, do you have elders? He told me, 3 of us are elders. I said, all right. And 3 of us are deacons. And I said, oh, and you want to plant 3 churches? Will that church remain? And he told me, what do you mean? And I said, I think, brother, you are running too much. You are not ready to plant any church. He had already thought he's going. And he told me why. So he came to visit, to our church, and he told me, I need to talk. Let's talk. What were you saying on the phone? You saying and I said, I love you, brother. I don't think that is the way to go. You just need to hold back. And after like 2 months, 3 months, he came back and told me, you know what? Thank you very much.
I can imagine. Thanks for sharing that. And I can imagine when Matthew told you to rest, you're thinking, this crazy British guy, he just doesn't know what he's talking about, But I have to commend, because I want to go to Matthew, because British culture gets a lot of things the rest of us don't. I'll be the first one to acknowledge that. One of them is you stop at 10 and 2 every day to drink coffee or tea. That's all of us should put that into our life. But the other is they get holiday. They get and understand, I got to take a break. I got to rest.
Drives me crazy.
And Matthew hates it. And this is ironic that he gives you that advice, but then he's like, you take too much time. So Matthew, what's the impact you're seeing in Europe and Britain and those places?
Yeah, I think it is about the friendship piece. We just did a conference in Oxford, England, this past summer, and on pastoral perseverance, and a good number of pastors from quite a fair distance came together, and just there's nothing that we were saying that's particularly new or profound. It's just simply stop, rest, develop friendships, invest in your family, take time to guard your own soul, and then you'll persevere. And that perseverance piece is so vital. Yes, you might be running hard now, and there may seem to be some good fruit from that, but you're not going to last. And it'd be far more effective if you play the long game and be saying, what does ministry look like for the next 30 years for me? What does faithful, long-term, persevering ministry look like? And that takes work to be able to put in place some practices and rhythms of life to be able to last the long term. One thing I was going to share though about just the impact of particularly Church on Places cohorts is what we're doing here isn't unique to a Western intellectual educated culture. So there could be a conference or a resource ministry or a seminary, and it's going to equip you for a certain context, a certain space. But this model, the cohort model, works well whether I'm in Cuba or in the Filipino jungle or in Uganda or East Africa. It's quite simple. It's just get together, good group of guys, learn from each other, understand what the scripture teaches about what it means to be a pastor, what it means to be a church, and encourage and strengthen each other along the way. And it's so reproducible. So we can do this work in so many different places around the world without having to do a whole lot of tweaking to what we're trying to teach, because it's universally true. These principles about pastoral ministry and healthy, robust church ministry. And the impact of that is universally valid, whether I'm in Scotland or in the Philippines. The impact of a healthy pastor thriving is a stronger church that's thriving, which is to reach the unreached, no matter where you are. And so it's accessible to anybody.
When we're talking about impact, I know some people are helped by just tangible numbers. Mm-hmm. And our ministry is hard to measure sometimes because these are the kinds of stories we hear that teaches us and encourages us in the impact we're having. But let me just broadly throw out a few numbers to help people understand the level of impact we're trying to have. We have about 160,000 copies of our books in print around the world in the last 15 years. We have over 100,000 listens to the podcasts that we have. We have several cohorts. I think we're moving close to about 2,000 people, both through Church and Hard Places, the practically trained pastors cohort that we've done for the last 6 years. Close to 2,000 people who have gone through those cohorts in one way or another. Hundreds staying at Shepherd's houses all around the world. Yeah. And we talk to pastors literally every day in one way or another. We're having conversations, we're exchanging messages, but this is what this has become. And we're so thankful for that. But at the same time, because we are a ministry that is trying to provide all these kinds of services and care for free to pastors, we have to raise funds to be able to do this kind of work. We need ministry partners, individuals and churches and others who will come alongside us so we can continue to serve the pastors who really need this the most. Yeah. Before we go there, I do want to ask Matthew one question I think is helpful to understand. Matthew, what's a hard place? We use this terminology. Church in Our Places, we talk about a practical term. We're helping pastors thrive in hard places. What are we talking about? What's a hard place?
So a hard place is relative. So a hard place in North America might feel different to a hard place in Kenya, but essentially, a hard place is a place where life is hard. And so there are certain aspects where it's harder to do certain things in one part of the city than it is in another part of the city. And that's usually, you can think of the word lack of access to training, lack of access to resources, lack of access to well-paying jobs, lack of access to decent housing, lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to some of the support systems we've been talking about this morning, lack of access to a salary as a pastor because of the income of the people in my church. And so areas of lack, whether that's resource poverty, spiritual poverty, because there's just darkness is lack of churches, or social economic poverty. And so areas of poverty around the world, poor communities, that could be a remote rural village, could be an inner city slum, but areas of poverty, lack. And with that comes all these social issues where you have areas of concentrated poverty. And so social issues that we see prevalent in each of these areas that we're working with, whether Detroit or Sao Paulo, is going to be mental health, abuse, addictions, fatherlessness, and lack of access to good education, so often literacy. Those issues tend to be prevalent. And that's not a small section of the world's population.
Mm-hmm.
A third of the world lives on less than $2.50 a day. A third of the world lives on less than $2.50 a day. In Africa, where Ronald's at, the majority of people in his context are going to live in deep poverty, and it's certainly true in Latin America as well. But most of our training and our resources and our conferences for pastors and for churches are assuming you're not doing ministry in that context, are assuming you're doing ministry in a context where there is no lack, where your church grows and you get more money. That's the opposite in hard places.
In most places in the world, too.
Your church grows, and actually it becomes a drain on your resources. It doesn't add to your resource base. And so we want to come alongside these guys who are doing faithful ministry in just really hard places, but they're there. And they're going to be the most effective person at reaching that community. And so we want to help them do that well.
I also want to add something you touched on, but just a hard place is also, there are places that are just more spiritually dark and oppressive than others. And it might be in a really wealthy area as far as resources, but there's a lot of spiritual darkness. And I think of certain kinds of places, even in North America, that fit that category. I just did ministry in a place that is a very wealthy place, but very, very spiritually dark. Very few churches, very few pastors that are there. Yeah. And it's the pastors there are struggling just simply because it's such hard, spiritually oppressive work in that environment and in that culture. And so it's a lot of it has to do with, like you talked about, the resource poor. Most of the world lives in that way. I think a lot of us forget that. Yeah. But there's also a spiritual oppression that's coming against the work of the gospel to advance throughout the world, for the church to advance throughout the world. And pastors are on the front lines of that. So ministry is just hard in general. We would just say that. But then there are some circumstances and situations throughout different countries and places around the world that, because life's just uniquely hard, it makes ministry that much harder. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about the need that we have. As I mentioned, we do this work and we praise God for the way it's grown and the team we've assembled through the years, and even to be able to have this conversation now. But one of the challenges that we have is that our ministry is growing, like you're talking about, and because we are fully funded through individuals who give, through churches who partner with us, that we have to raise that even more. Yeah. And we've got to be able to continue in that to be able to do the work that we want to continue to do. We want to absorb the growth and continue to expand because the need's so great. And quite frankly, there's still not a lot of ministries and people who are pastoring the pastors and trying to care for them in that way. So as we come to the end of the year, we're approaching a key time. We are like most nonprofits in that the majority of those kinds of funds to support the ministry come in the fourth quarter, in the last 3 months of the year. So we need people's help to try to get us there. we've set a goal to raise $500,000 by the end of 2024, the end of December, which is just right around the corner. And we need your help. And so one of the things that we're trying to just encourage people to do that is if we had 100 churches that each gave $5,000 by the end of the year, we could hit that goal, and that will allow us to continue to just press on and press forward. Yeah. So we want to ask churches to really consider and pray about being someone who could be one of those 100 churches that would give $5,000 to allow us to continue this work. Yeah. But even if you're not that church, whether it's a $50 gift or whether it's a $50,000 gift, all of it is incredibly helpful. We need an army to come together financially to be able to continue in this work. And so we want to appeal to anybody who was listening to this, watching this, that we need you to be able to continue in this work. And we want to ask you to pray and consider on whether you might be willing to give something by the end of the year to help us reach this $500,000 goal.
Yeah, let me put in a couple of different contexts to help people think through this. So when it comes to think about investing in missions, the missions of the church to go and reach the unreached, there's a few options you have, right? You can invest in a seminary, which is great for getting a pastor to get started in ministry. Or invest in a missions agency, which does great work, critical work in raising up a cultural outsider to be sent to a new culture to do pioneer missions. And again, helping ministry get started. You can invest in church planting to help a church get started. But what Practical Shepherding is doing is we're helping these new pastors, these church planters, these missionaries persevere in the work for the long term. There's an army of men around the world who God has called out to reach the unreached through the preaching of the gospel and the planting and leading of healthy gospel preaching churches. An army of men that have been at it now for 3, 4, 5, 10 years, faithfully working in their communities, seeing people come to faith, being baptized, their churches being established. And that army of men needs help. That army needs people to come alongside them, to provide the resources, the care, and the friendships that they need to persevere. And Practical Shepherding is really coming alongside those men in the trenches, saying, you've been here, we see you, we care about you, we're here to help you to thrive in this work. So this is a missional endeavor. You can start a church, but if it's not here in 5 years, that was a waste of your effort. You can train a man for ministry in a seminary, but if that guy quits in 5 years, what was the point? But Practical Shepherding is saying, we want to see these guys last 10, 15, 20 years of faithful ministry for the long term. And that's what this investment does. The other side of it is the opportunities that are ahead of us. There's so many opportunities for Practical Shepherding right now it's exciting to see what the Lord is doing. So we're not asking people just to invest in what's happening today. We're asking to invest in the ministry because of what is on the table for us. We pray, Lord willing, to see a new cohort started in Pakistan, to see our resources translated into Urdu, one of the most hardest and least reached countries on earth. We pray to see North African cohorts started, majority Muslim context, men who are pastoring churches, planting churches, missionaries who are going into North Africa. They need help, they need support, they need care. We'd love to see rural cohorts across North America, where often those doing ministry in rural places, small places, they're the ones who feel the most isolated, the most poorly resourced. We want to start 4 regional rural cohorts in North America next year. And so there's opportunities. We're ready. We stand primed and ready to lean into these opportunities. But we can't do it. We can't take that step unless others come behind us and say, yes, let's go. Let's go to Pakistan. Let's go to North Africa. Let's get these rural church planters and pastors equipped and supported. And let's see this army of men and their wives and other ministry leaders persevere for the long term. That's a worthwhile investment. And that's what we're inviting people to join us in doing.
So Matthew, if someone wants to just know more about what we're doing, or even how to give, how to find out more about the ministry, practicalshepherding.com is the best way to just go and access all of our resources, to see all the things that we're doing. You can sign up for we have a newsletter that comes out through email every week that just updates you on the content and the different things that we're doing. So you can contact us and sign up for those kinds of things. But if you'd like to give to the ministry specifically, you can go to the website and give in that way. You can pray for us, and you can also spread the word. We would encourage you to, even as you've watched this, that you would send it to someone else who you think might be interested in supporting and knowing about what we're doing specifically to try to take the gospel around the world through investing in pastors so that those churches will be able to thrive and send people to the places where the gospel is not heard yet. Amen. I want to make one more final appeal. There's people out there who don't have a lot of money, but really want to support this work and believe in what we're doing. Maybe even a pastor we help, and he knows he doesn't have any money, but he just really wants to be able to help. If we could get 1,000 people to just pledge $25 a month for the next year, that would go a long way to be able to allow us to continue in the ministry we're doing, but also to expand into these different cohorts that we're starting. We're expanding the Shepherd's House locations. We're trying to grow in more resources and the content cohorts and care, all to be able to do more with that. A gift of $25 a month could actually go really far. Yeah. And I want to appeal to anyone who wants to help support this work but thinks that won't matter, that won't make a difference. And I just want you to know it will. And I want to encourage you to even pray about giving, even if it's $10 a month, but to commit to a monthly gift for the next year for us so that we can continue in this work. And we'd love for you to be a part of that and partner with us in particular in that way.